Okay, we're good.
Thanks, Allison. And welcome to everybody to the January 12th, 2022 meeting of the Open Space Board of Trustees. I'm Karen Holweg, and as the vice chair, I'm going to be chairing the meeting tonight. Hal is joining us from a remote location, so you'll see his face on the screen, but he may have an unsteady internet connection. So we'll proceed. And first of all, the roll call. Hal?
I am here.
Michelle Estrella?
Estrella here.
Caroline Miller?
Present.
Dave Kuntz?
Here.
And Karen Holweg is here as well. So we've got everyone here. And because this is a Zoom meeting and we follow the city's guidelines for Zoom meetings, Allison, would you review those guidelines, please?
Yep. Okay, so thank you for joining us this evening. In order to strike a balance between transparent engagement and online security, the following rules will be applied to tonight's meeting. This meeting has been called to conduct the business of the City of Boulder, so activities that disrupt, delay, or interfere with the meeting are prohibited. The time for speaking or asking questions may be limited, and no person shall speak except when recognized by the person presiding, and no person shall speak for longer than the time allotted. In order to unmute yourselves later on during public comment or public hearing, we will need a full name and not just a phone number or Tom's iPad. We would ask you to rename yourself or send me a message in the chat and I can rename you. No video will be permitted except for city officials, employees, and invited speakers or presenters. All others will participate by voice only. The person presiding at the meeting shall enforce these rules by muting anyone who violates any rule. The chat function is enabled to host only, so that's for Zoom related questions. Those will come to me. Please, no content questions, and only the host and individuals designated by the host will be permitted to share their screen this evening. When we do get to public comment or public hearing, we will give you a chance to raise your hands. You can find that raise hand feature if you open your participants box, click on those three dots down below and select raise hand. You can also sometimes find it in the reactions icon at the bottom of your Zoom menu. And if you're joining by phone, you can raise hand by pressing *9. And that's it.
Thanks, Allison. As always, the first item of business on our agenda is the approval of the minutes. And I'd like to start with page 1 and ask if the board members have any revisions to the material on page 1. I have just a couple of things. First of all, thank you for the good list of public comments under agenda item 2. There were 3 little phrases that I thought would enhance a few of these. On the second one, Margaret LeCompte spoke against land disposal for South Boulder Creek flood mitigation as, and I want to add, it is not supported by open space charter purposes, just to make it read more easily. And then 2 further down, to follow the pattern for the rest of them, I'm suggesting adding a phrase at the end. Ray Bridge expressed criticism of the South Boulder Creek flood mitigation groundwater model report due to geological shortcomings. And then the next item, Jean Aschenbrenner spoke against land disposal for South Boulder Creek flood mitigation because it provides poor experiences for recreationists.
Karen, I just want to ask, like, to what degree you think that the minutes should represent sort of what was said versus elaborating on it and explaining why that person said that? You know,
I don't think that there needs to be any further elaboration. I was just adding words that the speakers used when they were presenting.
right. So, I mean, I know it's like on the video, it's on the record, but to then add because of or due to, that's already sort of on the video record.
Well, because the rest of them have that pattern, I'm suggesting adding those two to follow the same pattern as the other 10 or so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with that. It's just following the pattern.
Yeah. Okay, anything else on page 1? Okay, on page 2, does anyone have any revisions? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
I so move.
I'll second.
Thank you. Okay, all in favor, raise your hand, please. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Now, we're going to have a little bit different format for the meeting tonight because of the Marshall Fire. And so the second item on the agenda is going to be an update on OSMP's response to the Marshall Fire and impacts to OSMP properties due to the Marshall Fire. So Dan, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Karen. And for any members of the public, as Karen said, the open public comment will be right after this update. We thought that the public may benefit from hearing this update first and foremost, as it's on all of our community's minds. And with that, you know, before we begin to describe the level of involvement from the department, as well as some direct impacts to the OSMP system, I just want to first take this moment on behalf of really the entire department to express my deep sadness and my profound heartfelt thoughts and prayers to all those who have been impacted by the Marshall Fire. It was really nearly impossible for any one of us to emotionally be prepared for such a disaster that unfolded on December 30th. And for me, the only way I could describe it, it felt like a sucker punch to the gut. I was actually getting an early start on the weekend and was out of the region with very low cell reception. And so my phone started to dribble in some of the information as it was unfolding that day. And it was just this deep sinking sickness feeling that overcame me. And again, the only way I can describe it is just a sucker punch. And we as a community have been through other sucker punches quite recently. So it really felt like a double whammy, if you will. And so again, just heartfelt thoughts and prayers out to everybody who was directly impacted, and to know that all of us are working on your behalf, and hopefully the actions we're able to take as city staff, and I know I could speak to the county staff and Louisville and Superior staff as well, to knowing that we're all in this together, and hopefully our actions are able to make a difference for some of you. So with that, if we can go to the next slide. Do we have the slides up?
I think Leah is working on it.
Okay.
There we go.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank-
it's sharing on my, oh yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, it's, I think you have the notes section on too. Is that right or no? Oh, no. Are we good? All right, so you were able to see the, let me see, I'm not able to see it for some reason.
We have the slideshow column on as well.
I'm on the second.
There we go.
There we
we
go.
go.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you. What we'll be doing, I'll be joined today by John Potter, Deputy Director of Resource and Stewardship, who will be actually leading us through most of this presentation. And I guess that introduction is a way of also recognizing the fact that in my absence on those couple of days around that holiday weekend, John was serving as my director delegate and overseeing the responsibilities that go with the director position. And so John so capably stepped in and provided overall leadership coordination for OSMP during that Thursday and Friday time period. And so John is more than qualified of providing us all with a more intimate look at some of the details later on. So I'll be turning things over to John fairly quickly, just to give you a little bit of recap, but I will lead us through the opening and thanks. And then John will take us through the rest of the agenda, which will be fire condition and impacts, fire assessment and recovery. And then we'll turn it over to the board to see if there's any questions and what responses we're able to provide you with tonight. So Leah, if we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So I realize that this table is hard to work through. It's a little bit of a placeholder, but and I'll get to the details in just a bit. But as John is going to detail in just a moment or two, roughly about 2,000 acres of OSMP land interests were impacted by the Marshall Fire. And really, while our department is set up and we're trained and we're prepared to provide critical assistance for any disaster that unfolds and takes place in our vicinity of the city, when a disaster such as the Marshall Fire directly impacts the OSMP system, it demands a comprehensive department-wide effort and truly becomes an all hands on deck type of situation for our department. In the case of the Marshall Fire, nearly every work group and dozens of staff have been involved in some form or fashion in either the initial fire response or afterwards when we transition quickly into recovery and assessment efforts. Through January 9th, staffers recorded just under 1,000 hours on Marshall Fire response and recovery efforts. So you can get a sense with 1,000 hours in just the first just through last Friday, and those hours are continually being added on this week and probably for a few weeks yet to come. And the table up on the screen provides us with the details of what some of the staff involvement looks like. And I put this up in this format because I think that some of the board may know and some of the public may know, but it's when a disaster takes place in our system, OSMP has such a varied role and diverse role in how we respond and then how we are involved in recovery, that I thought it would be helpful to give you a flavor and a sense of what the staff involvement is, in what areas, and some general roles that we play in emergency and disaster situations. So up on the top left-hand, the left-hand column sort of describes the various work groups or service areas, if you will, of the organization. And in the right-hand column, it describes a little bit more of the details of what the actions were and what the roles and responsibilities were, in particular to the Marshall Fire response and recovery. So up on the top are our rangers. And I wanted to start with them because they were involved in the initial fire response and all the law enforcement activities that took place during that afternoon and evening. Roughly about 150 hours of ranger time was spent responding to the grass fires and bravely defending homes and structures. In addition to direct response to the fires themselves, many of our rangers were also involved in carrying out neighborhood evacuations, going door to door at times. They were involved in traffic mitigation and control efforts to help assist with the evacuations and folks that needed to get out of their areas. They were involved in community outreach and support. So those folks that may have lost their homes or wondering how they could get assistance, our rangers were often there to help support and answer those general questions. In addition to that, going back to the open space system itself, they were and have been involved in the enforcement of closures that are in place in the burned areas on our system in order to keep those areas safe and to keep the visitors out, to keep them safe and to keep our resources protected while we carry out damage assessments. And as well as they do assist with the actual assessments that are underway to try to get a better feel for how the Osmp system was impacted. Next, we have folks from our facilities work group, and we actually have several facility members that what we call are part of our red carded staff. In other words, they have been trained on fire to participate on fire response. So we had several of our facility team members that actually participated directly on fire response and bravely defended homes and structures. In addition, the facility staff also have been and still are addressing impacts to Osmp buildings and structures in the burned area that were affected. And those are mainly along the Cherryville Road area. Next, we have our resource and information services staff and our real estate staff. The RIS staff in particular, they covered 13 shifts at the Emergency Operations Center. So that meant coming in, covering the center over at night, on the weekends, on the holidays. And out of that, they were responsible for creating evacuation and road closure maps and maps that help first responders battle the fire. They are now transitioning into providing technical and data support for our staff who are collecting damage assessments and the information that the assessments are coming up with. Our real estate staff is also critical in supporting the damage assessments efforts and are also providing the ways that other entities need to access our lands, whether it's for fire investigation or whether it's for continuing to look at the system from a fire perspective. Our business services staff were right on it because they knew from learning from the flood that what was really important right off the bat was that we develop the proper and the accurate tracking systems that are needed and going to be needed to accurately document all the staff time and all the expenses that are being brought to bear during not only the fire response, but also all the recovery efforts that have been going on over the past couple of weeks and will be continuing. And this type of tracking and documentation and how we do it is critical because it will be needed in order to meet FEMA requirements and any other reimbursements that the department may end up seeking. We have staff from our agriculture and water program area, our vegetation program area, and our wildlife program area. And they are they're providing on the ground damage assessments with regards to our agricultural and water infrastructure. And that includes our fencing and our gates. They also are providing critical assistance to one of our agricultural tenants who out in the area along Cherryville who is significantly impacted. And keeping in very close communications with that tenant and assessing livestock's health. And as John might allude to, we lost livestock out on the system during the fire. And the vegetation and wildlife staff are also conducting some preliminary assessments of our natural resources. And those assessments we realize are also going to have to be going on into the spring during the green up period of the season coming up. We have staff from represent our cultural and historic program areas, and they are conducting damage assessments of the known cultural and historic resources that are in the affected burn area. We have a couple of known significant resources that did achieve some form of damage, and so they're out there assessing what the extent of that is. And of course, we have a number of staff from our trails program area, as well as our trailheads and sign program areas, who quickly got on the system and are continuing to wanting to get onto the system to do damage assessments of all the trails in the burned area, the trailheads, the signage, and the visitor infrastructure that may have been impacted by the fire. They were also involved in preparing and continuing to prepare signage for documenting the fact that this burn area is close to the public right now. We have a number of staff that sort of work on communications in some form or fashion. And this staff was critical in coordinating external messaging. The board was benefit of some of that messaging that went out over that initial weekend to keep you up to date on what we were seeing. They help and are helping to continue to coordinate media inquiries that continue to come in. They have been reaching out to our open space partners in Superior and Louisville and providing assistance when they can. And they actually, a staff member helped to provide and assist the county in Louisville and Superior in their town hall style meetings that was held last Thursday night, I believe. And we had staff that actually worked with the Boulder Chamber in order to relight the Boulder Star to provide the community with a little bit of inspiration as we go into this period of recovery. We have staff from education and outreach who are already thinking about community programming that they can put together around the fire, whether it's for healing or whether it's from, even more so issue orientated type of programming around this event. We are also getting prepared to how we may be able to utilize volunteer support for when and if that's needed. So we have staff that are putting their brains around that subject area. And we have members of the directors team, which consists of our deputies and science officer and community engagement coordinator. And all of us on the directors team are providing that overall department coordination being led by John Potter, having sort of that glue of where all the information is funneling under is really critical, and kind of making sure that everybody's got the resources that they need during this time is really important. And again, John is our point person on that. And we are also reaching out and partnering with Boulder County Open Space leadership, because we know that the burned area also incorporates a significant amount of their lands. So the question of how and when we open back up to the public, those communications and decisions ought to be done in collaboration. And so there's a number of subject matters, including the damage assessments that we're doing and reaching out to the county to make sure that we're in line for how these decisions are being unfolded and undertaken. So I hope that gives you a flavor for what a disaster response looks like. And of course, this one, because it directly impacted our system, is about as much of an all hands on deck as you can get. And with that, on behalf of all the directors team members, I just want to pass along my heartfelt thanks to all of our staff members who, of course, gave up their holiday weekend and worked nights and continue to work, go above and beyond their normal schedules to support all the recovery efforts that are happening now. You guys are troopers, and I just can't thank you enough for coming together like you did. One of the great sort of silver linings for me because I was out of town for the first 2 days of this, was watching this unfold and our staff coming together almost organically around this, and knowing what their roles and responsibilities were. And there was no question of whether or not we're all going to get together for a meeting on New Year's Day, for instance. It wasn't a question of if, it was just a question of tell me when and I'll be there. And so just my heartfelt thanks to all of our staff. And so with that, I am going to turn things over to John to lead us through the rest of the presentation. And I think we could probably move on to the next slide with that.
Thanks, Dan, and good evening, board members and members of the public. I'm just going to go through a little bit around the conditions that we saw on the day of the fire, which you'll recall commenced on Thursday, December 30th. In the late morning, I think around 11 a.m. was when we first started to hear that there was a fire in the Marshall Mesa area. It was a very windy day with winds blowing over 100 miles an hour for long stretches of time. Firefighters saw the fire really moving at the speed of the wind and jumping long distances throughout the day. In these photos, you can see the effects of the wind as evidenced by the down power lines along Marshall Road. Staff on site during the fire said that they saw 4-foot pieces of plywood flying through the air and power lines and trees blown down all over the place. By the way, before we move to the next slide, many thanks to Tori Johnson on our facilities and fleet team, a red carded staff who was on site during the fire, and he provided a lot of the images that you'll see tonight. Next slide. Some additional images from the day of the fire. Back burning after the main front ran through, images of concentrated areas of woody vegetation producing significant flame fronts and sparking. Staff reported cars, cottonwood trees, fence posts, really anything that was wood were all sparking and spotting additional fires with the wind. Sparks and fire embers were getting carried as far as 15 miles away with the strong winds. And a big factor in this fire, besides the high winds, was how dry it was, with absolutely no moisture on the ground. Vegetation grew from moisture we received during the spring, but dried out through the summer and fall. We were in fire restrictions across the county due to the lack of precipitation. And I don't think we've ever seen no snow in October, November, and most all of December. So this led to highly flammable fuels fed by the extreme wind speeds. And this prevented the use of many firefighting tools, including fire breaks, back burning, and aerial water drops. Next slide. Next slide, Leah, please.
I think there's a pretty big lag tonight, so
Oh,
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, it's clicked on mine. It's just in a minute.
gotcha.
Thanks, Allison.
We're really, thanks to John Morley, Mo Valenta, Kendall Ryan, Jen Sherry, and Charlie Philbrick for being on top of the geographic information related to the fire, which is shown in this map. Among other really important responsibilities that team had with the Emergency Operations Center. This map shows the extent of the burn area. So the entire fire covered approximately 6,000 acres, shown in the red outline and the shading here on this map. Osmp properties are the light olive color under the red shading, such as around the west side of Marshall Lake. Joint city-county open space is the bright green, and county open space is the dark green. You can also see the Louisville open space on the Davidson Mesa that's in brown, the brown color. The map shows somewhat how the fire spotted out in front of itself in a few areas. My understanding is that we were pretty lucky that the wind died down and towards the end of the day on Thursday, or this could have continued further northeast into additional populated areas. Overall, as Dan mentioned, about 2,000 acres of OSMP managed property was impacted, and I'll break that down further in a minute. Next slide. I'll show a few slides that zoom in and focus on the OSMP managed properties. This is the Marshall Mesa area. As I'll describe more in a minute, here we had significant impacts to the Marshall Mesa Trailhead, which is currently closed, along with the entire burn area is also currently closed. The grasslands across the burn area are mostly mixed grass and some xeric tallgrass prairie with typical vegetation heights of 2 feet or less, significantly less in the areas that we have managed grazing throughout this whole area. These plant communities typically include a mix of vegetation, bare ground, and rock, and provide important habitat for ground nesting birds, rare butterflies, and other invertebrates, many small mammal species, lots of prairie dogs, raptors, and really a rich assortment of plants and animals. Next slide. Chad Brotherton and the Trails team got some early photographs of the damage prior to the snowfall. Early reports are that much of the grass crowns are still intact due to the rapid spread of the fire. This is evident from these photos and could be encouraging from a revegetation standpoint. There are some concerns about wind erosion depending on how things go through the winter and spring, and it's really likely to be some time before we'll have a full natural resource assessment completed. But Lynn Riedel, Kelly Ewing, Megan Bowes, and others will be out there as soon as the snow melts, if not sooner, to start to understand where we might have erosion issues or invasive species concerns. Next slide. The coordination and organized approach of the Trails team has been exceptional. Chad Brotherton, Bo Clark, Gabe Wilson, Zach Stansfield, Hillary Dees, and others, including Ben Verrill on Trailheads, have done a great job getting to work, starting to understand and manage the impacts of the fire on trails and trailheads. Pictured here is the loss of the restroom at Marshall Mesa, railing and boardwalk losses, and other impacts. The team is in the process of assessing the kiosk, which was at the trailhead, as well as signs, fencing, and other visitor-related infrastructure. Next slide. Moving to the northeast, as the fire went in the Cherryville Road area, the biggest impacts for OSMP were to the Hogan Homestead and the Fox Stone Barn, pictured here. Julie Johnson, who is the chief steward of historic buildings, asked me to publicly thank the firefighters for saving Babe Hogan's house, specifically Dave Gustafson, Tori Johnson, Louis Aldaba from OSMP staff, and Brian James from the Wildland Fire team, who mobilized OSMP Fire Engine 2534 on the afternoon of the fire. The Hogan Homestead, though not listed on the National Register, is historic, and the firefighters did a heroic job limiting the damage to this site. You can see the wall of flame in the picture above as it roared towards the homestead. While we did lose historic buildings on the Hogan site, what remains is sufficient to continue to consider it an historic area. Andy Pelster, Ryan Middleton, and Brian Walton have been instrumental in supporting Mr. Hogan's operation, which I'll discuss the impacts there a bit more in a minute. but Andy reports that the Hogan barn and 2 small storage sheds were lost at the site, and a loafing shed and approximately 5,000 bales of hay were lost across the street.
Mm.
No other tenants were impacted besides Mr. Hogan. Next slide. So just north of the Hogan homestead on Cherryvale Road, there was significant damage to the Fox Stone Barn. This structure is on the National Register of Historic Places. The second picture with all of the Excel trucks alongside it shows the loss of the roof. Because it's on the National Register, it is eligible for federal aid, but the state is working with Julie to help determine if the barn can be saved. And late breaking news that Julie wanted to share as of this afternoon is that it looks like History Colorado will be providing us direct financial and technical support to do the historic structure assessment of this property. Next slide. Finally, the area east of Cherryvale Road, the fire burned northeast and easily jumped over 5 lanes of US 36 and a bikeway with the wind. This is one way of understanding the extreme conditions of this particular fire, to realize how easily the fire crossed what is essentially a 500-foot paved fire break of US 36. This entire area of OSMP property is also under a closure, and thanks to Burton Stoner and the Rangers and to Lisa Gonzalo for quickly getting the appropriate closures in place and managing people's curiosity about the fire damage that occurred. Next slide. So stepping back and looking at some of the total impact of the fire to OSMP as we know it so far, you can see here from the table that somewhere between 2,100 and 2,200 acres of property that OSMP has interests in were burned. This includes 137 acres of conservation easement property, which Bethany Collins and her team are already reaching out to understand how OSMP can help our conservation easement partners. We know that about 7 miles of trails were in the burn area and are currently closed while staff do damage assessments and figure out a plan regarding the trailhead. I've talked about the cultural resources, but preliminarily, Christian Driver is reporting that only 2 of the 63 cultural resources that were in the burn area are impacted, and that is the stone barn and the home site. Overall, across the burn area, we are seeing about 12 miles of agricultural fencing that were lost or impacted, 29 gates, and a stock watering pump house. Mr. Hogan lost 11 cattle, the hay that I mentioned, and some equipment. Andy is working with him to adjust the lease for the 2,000 acres of winter range that will be unavailable to his operation. We are still building an overall damage estimate, but it appears to be on the order of $1.5 million. I'm not really prepared to get into the details of that yet, since data was still coming in at 4:30 this afternoon, but this should give you an order of magnitude of what the damage was to OSMP. Next slide. Moving into assessment and recovery, more on the ground damage assessments are currently underway. Documentation is being done to conform with FEMA in case the city pursues FEMA reimbursement. We are participating in a state-led damage assessment, and they are meeting with FEMA tomorrow to discuss reimbursement eligibility. Assessment of natural resources, as mentioned, will need to go into the spring, most likely, to fully understand the health of the prairie ecosystem there. Staff have been collaborating with Boulder County Parks and Open Space, as Dan mentioned, as well as Lafayette and Superior Open Space. This will be a particular need as we address the trail closure and reopening considerations. And we will be getting on that as soon as we possibly can. For lessons learned and continuous improvement, OSMP will continue to collaborate with other departments, agencies, the Emergency Operations Center, the Fire Department, and others as we put together findings and make recommendations for future improvements. I've tried to mention thanks to a number of folks who were instrumental in either the emergency response or the damage assessment so far. And really at the strong risk and high likelihood that I left some key people out. I really can't say enough for everything that Mark Davison, Burton Stoner, and all of the rangers who worked from 11 a.m. when the fire started through the early hours of the next morning after the fire. All that they did for immediate response in such a professional and really courageous way. Throughout this, staff from across the department have really rallied. I was impressed with how quickly Lauren Kilcoyne and Sam McQueen and the finance staff put together a process and training around assessments. We've had Bill Wildenberg, Patrick Harbord, and their team working tirelessly on signs and communicating closures and the areas that are not currently safe to be in. Amy Wilhite and Dustin Allard have been assessing all of the ditches. Ben Mayer and Josh Maeda Jones supporting on all of the facilities work and getting dumpsters and equipment. Allison Eklund reaching out to partners and staff. Janelle Freeston and her folks getting ready for volunteers. Lisa Deeroff and her team getting ready with education and outreach messaging. Brian Anaker and Ann Lesberg getting us prepped for fire effects monitoring and thinking further about climate and fire. And finally, big thanks to Dan, keeping us all on track and focused throughout this effort. Really amazing coordination and caretaking going on across the department, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Next slide. So I've really probably gone on too long, but so the time has come for questions, and which we'll do our best to address tonight. There may be some things we're just not ready to cover too much yet, and we'll keep a list of those things to follow up on if we can't address them now. But handing it back over to you, Karen.
My screen is about as slow as Leah's in responding. Thank you very much, Dan and John, for the really substantive review of all the staff that was involved in the roles everybody played. It really opened my eyes to what was needed for OSMP to respond as a whole group. And it gave me a better idea of the staff's involvement. Why don't we go through the Q&A session just with hand raising? If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll call on people in sequence, and we'll get as many questions as we can answered. Dave?
Thank you, John. That was very informative, and the tragedy is really uncalculable. The question I have, though, is regarding staff, which all of us I know appreciate tremendously the effort that is put in or has been put in and continues to be put in. Can you speak to what impacts on staff actually are as far as fire damage or injuries or anything like that, so we have a better picture of kind of what's happening with the staff?
Yeah, I'm not aware that anyone was injured during the event or during the assessment so far. So I don't believe anybody was injured at all. Although certainly what some of our staff saw as the fires came through, from a mental health standpoint, is something that that supervisors and managers are going to have to be cognizant of, and we have begun to make resources available to anyone that needs it. I'm not really, if you're referring to staff living arrangements and personal housing impacts, I think several staff had some slight impacts to their properties, as well as some of our colleagues across the city lost their homes, as well as some of our tenants, staff, and a contractor that we do ecological consulting with also lost his house. Those are the damages that I'm aware of.
Yeah, John, I'll just add that we know that some of our dedicated volunteers also had lost their homes, so.
Thanks for that. And Karen, if I could just take 1 second more or 1 minute more, I do want to make a personal statement regarding the fatality that we know about Robert Sharp. It's a tragedy that he lost his life. He was a longtime supporter and proponent of open space, felt very dearly and protective of Marshall Mesa. And even though we often didn't agree over the years on a number of things, the staff always knew that his heart was in the taking care of and protection of open space, and Marshall Mesa especially. And I feel very sad, as I know a lot of other people, that he did lose his life. I'm sure he was trying to defend his property and doing that, and it's especially heart-rendering to know that. So the other thing is a longtime volunteer, Joanna Sampson, who died a few years ago, but whose house was near Robert's, I'm sure is gone as well. And she again was a longtime volunteer and supporter, did a whole bunch of historical work for the open space program, and had a wonderful house. And it's a tragedy that I'm sure her family is dealing with as well. But I wanted to mention Robert because he particularly, I think, is a good representative of the volunteer community that supports the Open Space and Mountain Parks program. And it's very sad that he lost his life.
Thank you, Dave. I couldn't agree more. Any other questions from board members? Al?
I don't have any questions. Thank you, John, for the concise presentation. I just wanted to note, I know between COVID, of course, and now this event, that our staff at OSMP has been pivoting after pivoting after pivoting all throughout more than going on close to 2 years. I have to imagine it's quite exhausting. And I don't even know if there's anything helpful I can say other than thank you for continuing on with it. It's deeply appreciated.
Yep. Dave?
Yeah, sorry, if I could just make one more comment, actually. You know, what strikes me about the aftermath of this event is that in our wildland fire approach, the focus has always been on forest environments.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is that even though historically grassland fires have been very widespread and damaging in particular areas, I don't think anyone envisioned the extent of damage from this fire that initially was pretty much carried by, grasslands. And I think publicly what it will do is open our eyes to the fact that not only are the forest environments particularly susceptible to this, given the history of our management of them, but grasslands are very important as far as wildland fires are concerned as well. And the other thing I don't think should be lost is that, from my perspective, this really turned into an urban fire. And the damage, even though, we can see on open space was, considerable, it pales in comparison, obviously, to the damage to the developed areas and the urban areas. And it just demonstrates that sometimes, no matter what, there was no way that this fire was going to be controlled except by natural factors, which primarily, as you noted, John, was the reduction in wind speed later later in the evening, actually, of that day. But it just strikes me that we're going to have a very extensive conversation on the role of grasslands in wildland fires as well, because this is obviously the most damaging fire in the history of the state. So I just thought I ought to make that observation. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. And go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for, all those things that Dave and Hal's mentioned, but also for keeping us in the loop with, the questions that have been asked over email and the responses that have been provided. I think that's been very helpful. I know that there's still a lot of questions and studies to be done about damage and what do we do about it now. We are a very smart and opinionated community, so I'm sure there will also be criticisms on all different levels. But I just wanted to know, like, how we can, to ask how we as OSBT members can support the OSMP staff during this time.
I have two reflections, and then John, feel free to add. One is, I think that often our community members will turn to you as a board to seek answers informally, whether it's running somebody into the store or whether it's your neighbor. And so I think any way that we could keep you informed so you could keep our community, help us keep the community informed, is always super helpful. So let us know what you're hearing and how we could support you and getting the information you need, because often our community members will turn to you all for information. So I say that that's one, is over the coming months, the conversations will continue, and the more we can all be involved in providing the information, I think that's super helpful. The second area is more mundane, Michelle, and it's more of just understanding. And I put a little bit of this in my email out to you all, I believe on a Monday, just saying that this was a significant impact to what we thought we would all be doing right now. And as you can imagine, a lot of things just needed to be dropped, put to the side while we dedicated the resources that were needed to put towards this. And those resources are going to be ongoing for at least a couple more weeks. Less and less staff will be impacted, but the impacts will continue throughout the month. And so just an understanding that we may need to do some agenda adjustments, and some things just may get delayed. I know we all don't like that, but just an understanding of the impacts it has to our work plans, because not every day does it all go according to plan. So Those are two observations I can make. And John, I don't know if you have any others you'd like to add.
Well, just, yeah, Dan, I'll just add that really appreciate the question, Michelle, and the support of the board. You know, we really tried to get you guys good information as the event was occurring and unfolding, so that you were able to communicate with community members as that might occur. And as we continue to get questions and inquiries from the public, we'll keep you informed about, as we get to those, we'll keep you informed about how we're looking at things and responding to concerns that the community might have. And again, like Dan was saying, just really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Got it. That's easy.
I have a quick question. I had an appointment in Denver yesterday, and for the first time, drove back into town on 36. And it seemed to me some of the individual isolated houses out on the north side of Highway 36 were burned, but the landscape surrounding the houses seemed to be untouched. And my assumption is that that was the result of the cinder storms from the 100-mile-an-hour winds. Do you have any observations about why, for instance, other than where cinders happened to fall, pine trees and so forth might not have been burned?
Yeah, I spoke with a number of the staff that were on site during the burn who were observing that, and they were really at a loss for why some areas burned and others didn't, be they vegetation or structures. And it was sort of almost like one firefighter said that it was almost like luck of the draw, but things were unwrapped. You know, it was happening so quickly, and just, you know, the wind would shift a little bit, and the front would move on, and that you know, that was really what they were seeing out there. I think what you hit on, you know, the embers were just going 2 miles out, in some cases up to 15 miles, they were saying, but regularly, consistently 1 mile, 2 miles out. So once that situation is going, it's sort of, the ember is going to drop down. And if it drops down into a gutter full of dry leaves, that house is in trouble. If it drops down into even a riparian area that has had no snow and no moisture, the woody material in those areas are going to burn significantly, and did on that day if they had the ignition coming into the area. So really a lot we don't know, and a very uncertain type of a climate that the fire experienced. And you know, that it was I think that was really what was driving it, Karen.
Thanks. Well, thanks everybody, all the staff that participated, all of the heartfelt comments that have been made by the board and staff. And it's, as many of you have already said, it's just another one of the kinds of experiences in 2021 that is going to leave a big scar on both the landscape and our community. We have now on the agenda scheduled the public comment period, and this is an opportunity for those of you who are participating in the meeting to take 3 minutes and either make a public comment about or ask questions about what we've just heard, or about any other item that is not on tonight's agenda. So please, if you have a comment on the Chubb conservation easement, there will be a separate public hearing for that. But any other topic is fair game. And if you have not signed up, if you would raise your hand or otherwise indicate to Allison that you'd like to speak, we'll get a line going, and people who wish to speak during this public comment period, now's the time.
Yep, we didn't have anyone sign up in advance to speak on public comment or on the public hearing. I see one hand, so we'll start with Alan. Just give me 1 second so I can set up the timer.
I think I also, Allison, noticed Lynn Siegel's hand up earlier in the meeting, so I don't know whether she's still interested in speaking.
Yeah, I don't see her hand anymore. I know
Okay.
sometimes she goes back and forth between meetings. So, Lynn, if you're still on and you do still want to speak, if you will raise your hand again, that would be great. Thanks, Lynn. We'll have you up next.
As soon as we get the timer on, Alan, it'll be
Yep.
your turn.
Yep, I'm just getting the background going here. Okay, Alan, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, now let's go back a few years. That was the Sunshine Canyon fire. I was terrified after that, and I still am terrified of it because it was a terrible event that took place with no wind. So I was very thankful for that. And as I hike around open space now, I see the amount of burnable material that exists on the west side of Boulder. So a fire in that area is something that we need to protect against. So I've sent, I think, 10 suggestions to Dan and to Open Space Board of Trustees. And I hope that a fire plan, an open space fire plan, will be put together, a master plan which has hard numbers of what it's going to cost to protect Boulder against a repetition of Marshall Fire. So I look forward to working with Dan and the board to try and come up with a good selection of solutions of how we can protect Boulder in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And Lynn, as soon as Allison has the timer up, please begin.
Okay, Lynn, you should be able to unmute now.
Thanks. First, let me know if you can't hear me absolutely perfectly. Interrupt me instantly. Okay,
You sound good, Lynn.
good. There's things here I do not understand. There was 4 minutes until they got to the Middle Fork fire up north and another fire. Both of those were taken out. Those were at 10 o'clock and 10:20 something from the article. The problem is someone videotaped the fire at the 12 tribes site, which is, I know exactly where that is. And when they went there, they got there in 3 minutes, but they couldn't find the fire for 10 minutes. So what the heck is going on? Robert, he might not have even known that the fire was not originating right at his house. And he may have been just defending the fire period as if he were at 12 tribes, 2,500 feet to the west. That might have been. It also might have been Robert's personality. We all know I myself might do something like that. And I'm very afraid, and I don't like to use the other F word, fear, but I'm afraid I have to, My brother's in South Boulder. He was getting out of there, going to Denver. This, with any gusts that could pull along that front, that wind front up north, boy, we were close. In fact, one of the places burned was up further north on 93 than the 10 tribes. I appreciate what John was saying about, I was listening to a thing from Israel today about their high-tech industry, and I was thinking what we need is some higher tech way of dousing a fire. But of course, duh, you can't do an aerial drop with 110-mile-an-hour winds, like forget that. But at least some better specification from the moment that someone sends you a video, a live person there. I mean, I watched that fire on that video, and yet we couldn't get it. It's stunning. Robert's brother called me back because I wanted some materials from the memorial service, Karen. And he's 7 years younger than Robert, very close now. They were estranged for many years, and he said it was his fault. His name is Milt. And they had 4 family members die within the last 40 days. So this was a real drama to their family too. I wanted to bring up Gilbert White. Yes, it's the built environment. Just like with a flood, you don't drown, you get hit by debris. It's the same thing with fires. This is the new normal, and we got to stop climate change ultimately, but we can what happened? 3 minutes, they were up there. They were at the site. They were at 12 Tribes. They couldn't find it. What the heck was going on? And I know this is a huge insurance issue and a hugely expensive liable potential situation. I get it. But boy, something's off here.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah.
And I'm sure when the sheriff's office finishes the investigation, we'll hear more about all that. Is there anyone else that would like to speak this evening?
I'm not seeing any other hands, Karen.
Okay, thanks, Allison. Okay, then it's time for us to take a deep breath and move on to item 4 on the agenda.
Great. Thank you. I just got done with my deep breath. For this, we are going to turn over to our real estate services staff, and I believe Jake Cassidy, a property agent, and Bethany Collins are here to support a presentation and then to support consideration of a motion on this item. So I don't know if Bethany, if you're first or if Jake's first, but turn it over to the two of you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we're just putting it on Jake to do the presentation tonight, and then both of us are available for questions after.
Yep, sounds good. So thanks, Dan and Bethany. Good evening, trustees. Tonight we will have a short presentation that will be going over the proposed acquisition and amendment to the Chubb conservation easement. We will have time to discuss and open it up to questions at the end. And yeah, you can see here the first slide. Sorry, I know it's lagging a little bit tonight. That's a photo of the Chubb conservation easement. So yeah, we can go to the next slide and kind of take a look at the agenda item itself then. All right, so 1 second. So this is a consideration of a motion to recommend the acquisition of a conservation easement interest over approximately 0.04 acres of land to be added to the Chubb conservation easement, and the recommendation and approval of an amended and restated conservation easement, which will allow for minor encroachments totaling approximately 100 square feet. We will cover those encroachments and the existing encroachments in the subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So you can see the two maps here. In the yellow is the extent of the Chubb conservation easement as it is today. And then on the right is a general vicinity map giving you an idea of where it is in Boulder. The 0.41 acre Chubb conservation easement encumbers a portion of the larger 0.96 acre private property located at 290 Hawthorne Avenue. The current landowner is Adam Chase. The property itself is in proximity to the Elvin New and Grape Lane open space properties. And it lies within Boulder city limits in Area 1 and is zoned as RL1, which is low density residential. Next slide, please. So we have a little bit of a timeline here on the history of the Chubb conservation easement and where we're at today. The Chubb conservation easement was acquired in 1977, and the intent of the easement is to maintain a natural, scenic, and open condition. It was acquired due to its location above the blue line as part of the annexation of the property into the city. The existing house was built in 1978, but in 1992, it was discovered that a portion of the structure encroached onto the conservation easement, and an encroachment easement was granted from the city to the landowner at the time via the disposal process. You can see in this photo the current encroachment, which is just a portion of those decks. You'll be able to see an aerial photo that'll give you a better idea of what the current encroachment looks like. So that kind of gives us the current status of the CE. And then in July of 2021, OSMP staff was contacted by a representative of the current landowner regarding replacement of the existing residence. Staff met with the representative on site to discuss the request adjacent to the portion of their property encumbered by the Chubb conservation easement. And the replacement structure would require a similar encroachment in both size and location to the existing encroachment. Next slide, please. So through those meetings, in exchange for allowing a new encroachment of similar size and location, which would require disposal of open space land interest, the landowner has proposed adding additional land to the Chubb conservation easement. Hopefully these maps can help depict the proposal. So you can see it's probably a little bit easier to see on that map in the upper hand right. The red is the existing encroachment that was agreed upon in the 92 document. And the 1978 house. The black crosshatch that's over the top of it is the proposed encroachment. So that's when we say a similar location, similar size. You can see the proposed encroachment, and then the purple on the left-hand map is the proposed addition to the Chubb conservation easement. The proposed addition is about 0.04 acres. And after initial consultation with OSMP resource staff, it's the department's opinion that the addition of the land would allow for further habitat and scenic resource conservation. It would also prevent the development of land, which is visible from the adjacent open space properties, trails, and is in proximity to the Silver Lake Ditch Corridor that you can kind of see on the map there. And it should be noted that the proposed encroachment would be a roof overhang and a deck with stairs. And we can come back to this slide later if we want to.
Jake, I had a question on this slide on the upper one. The upper crosshatch. What is that? What is that for?
Are you talking about the crosshatch over the CE or the black crosshatch?
On the upper right hand, or the upper right hand photo, there are two little crosshatch areas, and I'm wondering, one is containing the existing the other one, I'm asking, what is that for?
Yeah, so go ahead. I can jump in for just a second, because it is the way it has to be depicted in 2 dimensions is quite difficult, Dave. So picture it's a roof overhanging a deck, but because there's a hillside coming down from Hawthorne, so it really is a similar encroachment, but because both of those features would be encroaching, they are reflected in this as separate encroachments. But it is the roof overhang of a deck feature that would then have stairs down. The stairs would be on the private property, but a portion of the stairs would be encroaching as well. So there's no actual planned features that would be kind of foundational or surface impacts. They really are overhanging onto the conservation easement. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, certainly.
May I ask a follow-up question? It appears to me that there's a triangle, what is that? Probably east of the one with the red. That's just to the left of the evergreen tree. What is that one?
East of the red.
If you look at the red encroachment and the crosshatch area around it, and then move up the image, there's another little triangle of crosshatch.
Yeah, that's what we were just speaking of. So really they're the same encroachments, but because of topography, when you're trying to do it in site plans or in any sort of mapping plans, because of the slope, so it really is a roof overhanging a deck. So the one closer, so north on the image to the right would be a roof. And the ones where with including the current or the existing red encroachment is the deck and the stairs.
Okay.
Can I follow on that question just really quick?
Just one more thing, Hal. The line, the very delicate line outside of the Silver Lake ditch blue, is that the boundary for the ditch company itself?
That's actually the parcel line for the larger property itself. So we have the county tax parcels on there as well, but you can see that the conservation easement doesn't encumber that portion of the property.
So who owns the property between the very delicate black line and the blue of the Silver Lake ditch?
Bethany,
the neighbor, the neighbor to the east.
Neighbors to the east.
Yeah. And you actually bring up an interesting point because we are going through an annexation. There is an annexation on the property to the south application in right now. And our Grape Lane property, we're actually doing investigation because of that parcel discrepancy you're seeing on the south. But adjacent to this Chase property, the neighbor, you can potentially make it out a little bit better on the bigger map on the left, but the neighbor to the east does own up to that parcel boundary.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Pardon me, Hal, it's your turn.
Bethany, I'm just wondering more philosophically, do we make it a practice to carve out essentially roofs or appurtenances or features of building? Basically, help me understand why we wouldn't cut off a block that was more easily plottable and simpler. In prior easement waivers, etc., we've looked to simplify. Help me understand.
It's a good question, Hal. So the original conservation easement, the reason it's a perfectly straight line north-south is it followed the blue line, the old blue line, which now actually has moved. But it really, because they processed this as an encroachment over that blue line and over that conservation easement in 1992, we felt rather than carving out a portion of the conservation easement in some sort of disposal or land exchange or things like that, because these are overhangs and they are not really impacting the overall conservation objectives or conservation easement, that we could process it this way. And again, if the future home or anything like that were to be removed, or a deck, wasn't to be built or was to be removed, we still have that fully intact conservation easement legal description. Is that kind of where you were headed?
Oh, okay. So these areas that are hatched don't change the legal description of the CE? Yeah.
It's basically allowing the CE does not, and sorry, Jake didn't get to finish his presentation, but the legal description doesn't change. This allows, where the conservation easement doesn't allow structures in the CE, this allows an overhang of a structure. It still doesn't allow really structural, footprint, but it allows an overhang into the conservation easement. But it does not change.
Great clarification. Great.
Certainly, of course.
Okay, thanks. Back to Jake.
All right. Yeah, so we can come back to that one if there's further questions, but we can go to the next slide for now. So in addition to the added land, there's several other benefits of this transaction to OSMP. So the proposed new residence will actually be lower height than the current residence, which will help with the scenic conservation objectives of the easement. And I think Bethany had said about 5 feet lower today. So the landowner will also agree to remove the chain link attached to the split rail fence on the property boundary. And this is to enable better wildlife passage. You can see that chain link actually on the photo to the left there. So that will be removed, and that fence encircles the entire property on the southern side there. The landowner will also agree to remove a few non-native invasive trees as desired by OSMP staff. The landowner will also agree to convey the amended and restated conservation easement to the city. This is aligned with the conversation we had at the December board meeting where we discussed some of the ambiguities in our current CEs. This is a great opportunity to replace one of those older, more vague conservation easements with a more robust conservation easement that is more aligned with charter purposes and the property's conservation objectives. So I can give some examples of the added protections from the amended and restated conservation easement. It removes the right of gardening and or horticultural purposes and related improvements. It also removes the right for improvements related to play and recreation. It requires reasonable efforts to remove all non-native invasive species from the property, and it also requires for future fencing to be wildlife friendly. So those are just some of the things, and creating a better document for both us and the landowner to go off of. And you can also see the master plan strategies that align with this transaction. And then the photo on the right is facing south, and that's more or less the 0.04 acres we're looking at. And you can see the Russian olive tree in there that is called out as one of the invasive trees to be removed, and a Siberian elm in there as well. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. So short presentation. So given the net increase in protected land and stewardship enhancements, as well as the opportunity to update the conservation easement, OSMP staff believes the proposed conservation easement transaction is a net benefit to the city. Therefore, to enhance the conservation objective and further protect the natural and scenic resources, OSMP staff is recommending this conservation easement addition and amendment for approval. If it is approved, OSMP and City Attorney's Office will work with the landowner and his representative to finalize and execute the amended and restated conservation easement, conditioned on a city-approved development plan for the new residents. Thank you for your time, and we can open up for any other questions or comments that you may have.
Okay. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, no problem.
Questions, Dave?
So I have a question and a comment. I must say that the improved language of the conservation easement is greatly appreciated and vastly improves the previous conservation easement language. And so good for you guys. My question and comment is that I always think it's helpful to compare apples to apples. So what I am wondering is why the encroachment is 100 square feet and the additional easement is 0.04 of an acre. In my copious free time, I went and figured out how many square feet 0.04 of an acre is. And so I think it would be helpful to include that number rather than 0.04 of an acre. So you're comparing square feet to square feet or acres to acres. So either way, and if you still want to do 0.04 of an acre, I think it's worth a parenthetical of 1,742 square feet is 0.04 of an acre. So that's my comment.
Thank you for that, Dave. Actually, Jake asked me if we should put it in square feet or not. And typically, you know, my brain always goes to when you're building stuff, it's often in square feet. When you're talking about land, it's often in acres. So that's probably my fault that he didn't do that.
Well, I think it's instructive for people to understand, you know, what the city's getting. It's, you know.
Yep. Yeah, you have a great point.
Anyway, thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Al?
I just want to return quickly to this concept of encroachments because it's a little new to me. I'm not sure I understand it fully. And I'm just unclear on why we would want to establish a precedence of easements which are encroachable, whether minor or major, instead of taking the option of we're going to dispose the area impacted and gain this other net square footage. Help me understand why we do it that way.
Yeah, I don't know that that any of them are a regular thing, right? This doesn't. We don't get a lot of these requests, and this doesn't happen a lot. I think because here there is already precedence that there was a disposal action in 1992 for the existing encroachment. That is, and I think this is where I would probably diverge in that, you know, say that there's a divergence is because this is an aerial encroachment, it's above the actual land property resources in general, but because conservation easements protect on, over, and across, right? And so they do protect kind of that airspace. We do have to, you know, still consider it an open space interest, or in that overall definition of open space land interest, right? And so I would say, you know, from a if this were to become an ask or regular ask, and the comparison really would be, if it is an impactful ground disturbance on the conservation easement, I think we would certainly look at that differently and look at that as a disposal of a legal description or something of the conservation easement, where this is, again, overhanging the reason and the conservation objectives with this easement were scenic, natural, you know, keeping it in its natural and open condition. This property is incredibly, you know, it's very small, but it is untouched, and there are very few invasive, you know, species or any kind of weeds. And, you know, to say that for, you know, something that's, you know, kind of landscapable or anything is probably, you know, is pretty rare. And so our resource staff was pretty impressed with the condition of the property. And so the fact that this encroachment, again, overhangs and doesn't impact those features, those conservation objectives, is probably where we would set that line or set that bar, I would think, for these kinds of requests. Is that helpful?
It is, and if the ground under those overflying roofs is that valuable, that's great. The other side of it for me is just trying to leave simplified, you know, platting in our wake whenever possible. But I trust it to you. If that ground's that valuable, then I understand. Thank you.
Certainly.
I'd like to pursue a comment that you just made, Bethany, and build on it. Excuse me. At several places in the document, the quality of the natural vegetation and the resources are called out, as you just did. As Dave, I really like the provisions that you've added to the conservation easement, especially only allowing native species if new vegetation is to be planted. But I got the impression as I was reading through this that the landowner's use of this property, as long as they don't build gardens and have vehicles out there and use it for play and recreation, they can walk all over the property, right? Have I got that right?
To some extent, they can't create trails. They can walk in the area. They cannot do so that would create trails. And again, their obligation and what they would be monitored and enforced against is really that natural condition. So if it was monitored and determined that any activities, including walking all over it or anything, were to you know, significantly impact that natural condition, then we could have enforcement action against them. I will say, you know, again, this is a perpetual document, so it's not speaking of just this landowner. This landowner is incredibly has an incredible conservation ethic. He talks about his prime piece of artwork is something having to do with the Lorax. And he actually voluntarily and was very on board with removing things such as play equipment and things like that, and the ability to do gardening and have garden boxes or you know, small greenhouse food piles, things like that from the conservation easement. And so yes, they can walk on it's their property, but again, really the mechanism there is that enforcement if the natural condition is impacted. And you know, we've been monitoring this property consistently since at least, I believe, 2009, something to that effect. And it's been in stellar condition. So for again, where it is, how big it is, I mean, it really does look like a continuation of, you know, the neighboring properties in Sanitas to the west. So.
And thank you. And what you
Certainly.
said about social trails is exactly what I'm concerned about. Because we all know if you go out there and walk around and you walk in the same place, you end up with a social trail, and then you end up with invasives growing in that area.
Yep.
And I don't recall in the document that it says creation of social trails is not allowed. Have I missed something? Is that language in there?
It does say no roads or trails. And so we for on the conservation easement side, and I forget exactly what paragraph it is, I mean, what section it is, but there is a short, it would be in kind of the restricted or prohibited uses section. It does say no roads or trails can be created on the property. And so again, when you're dealing with conservation easements, a trail is a trail, whether it's a social trail or an improved public trail, which are also not allowed. So
okay, so
yep.
What you're saying is by definition, this document allows passive recreation as long as it does not create some kind of a trail.
Correct. And again, this is, the document in front of you is in close to final, but we could certainly say including social trails if that would help your brain, help your mind.
Well, I think that would be helpful. And the other component of that is not just the people created trails, but my perception is that, for instance, dogs are very habitual. And if they go the same place back and forth, there's going to be a social trail there with additional nitrogen and feces. So I would appreciate the addition of reference to no social trails, because any dog or person or anything that habitually uses the area could create a social trail and then add invasive species, which, based on what I've read here, the objective is to avoid that.
Yeah, we can clarify that to be including social and game trails. Really, they do also have a resident bear apparently, so or a bear that visits. I shouldn't say a resident, a bear that visits quite often. So yeah, we can certainly clarify that. One of their willingness to remove the chain link fence from the split rail really would deter the ability to even have pets to some extent, right? To keep them enclosed.
They'd be free roaming.
Right. Yeah. They wouldn't have an enclosure unless they did some sort of invisible fence, and we all know how those work. So they don't have pets and don't anticipate doing it. And that was a question of why is the chain link there and can you remove it? And they were very, very voluntary. I mean, very ready to remove it. So absolutely.
Good. And then explain to me what the development potential is. What can you imagine being developed on the little slivers that are added to the conservation easement?
Really, they could put, if an ADU would fit, they can put it. An accessory dwelling unit, if they could put, and I haven't, gone down to the depths of exact square footage, but things like sheds, large garden structures, garden sheds, if access allowed for it, they could even put a garage or, things like that back there. But really, I mean, we're talking about storage sheds and things of that sort. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone else have additional questions? Michelle?
Yeah, just for my own education, Bethany and Jake, how do you determine whether a social trail, just thinking how social bears are not, but is actually, if it's created by a bear or deer, because deer can also be like pretty habitual too.
We probably couldn't. So the idea of game trails is a pretty low possibility. So again, I think Karen's question about social trails really is, has the vegetation really been hammered so much that it's not going to come back, right? It's not going to recover. And so typically you would not see that on kind of this urban, wildland urban interface type property. You usually see game trails where there really isn't an alternative way to get somewhere, right? And so this is a fairly gentle sloping property and things. So when I said game trail, I meant more of what she's talking about of a dog or a pet creating, doing a same circle or something to that effect that would create the same thing that a human would. So we can clarify that language.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Okay, if there are no other questions, is there a motion?
I'll lift the motion.
You got, we would need to officially go to the public hearing at this point and then bring it back to the board.
Thank you, Dan.
Mhm.
Is there anyone in the meeting who would like to comment on this during a public hearing?
Give me just 1 second to get the timer ready. I'll let you know. Okay, Lynn, you should be able to unmute now. Thanks.
It seems to me that this is, I've been busy writing you a letter about the fire, but I got the gist of it, and it seems to me that this is a good agreement for this conservation easement. The city got, the trees that are invasive species out of the field, and better migratory patterns for the wildlife. And so I think that's a go, and thanks for working on it. I wish I could say more, but I'm just obsessed about this fire now, but thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment?
I'm not seeing any other hands.
Okay, thanks, Allison. So let's go back to the board and see if there's a motion.
I'll make the motion for the staff recommendation verbatim. I'm happy to read it if need be.
Why don't you go ahead and read it into the record since we're recording?
Wonderful. Staff recommends that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommend the acquisition of a conservation easement interest over approximately 0.04 acres of land to be added to the Chubb conservation easement, and approve and recommend that City Council approve the acceptance of an amended and restated conservation easement, which allows for minor encroachments totaling approximately 100 square feet pursuant to the disposal procedures of Article 12, Section 177 of the Boulder City Charter, and conditioned on a city-approved development plan for the new residents.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Hal and Michelle. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, please raise your hand.
Karen.
Go, Dave.
So Hal, I'm wondering if you would entertain a friendly amendment following the 0.04 acres in the third line, which would say parenthetically 1,742 square feet.
That is acceptable, yes.
And we're
Okay.
trusting you, Dave, on that math. You better be right.
Yeah.
No, I checked it thrice, so I'm good.
Okay.
It's
I was wondering-
approximately, you're good, you're good.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, all those in favor, please raise your right hand. Or do we have to do a voice vote on this?
If you could do voices, Karen, that would be great.
Okay. Dave,
Yes.
Hal,
Yes.
Michelle,
Yes.
Caroline,
Yes.
and I'm also a yes. So the vote's unanimously in favor of the motion. Okay. Dan, back to you for matters of the board. We're on
Great.
agenda item 5.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks, Bethany, for walking us through that one. And thank you for the board for your support. We've got one main item under matters from the board, and I've got a couple of verbal updates after our next presentation, but I first want to do an introduction. I am very proud to announce that we have successfully filled the Deputy of Trails and Facilities position. Jeff Haley, who was with Parks and Rec for many years, has joined us to accept that position, and his first day on the job with Osmp was on Monday. So I thought I'd use this opportunity to maybe have Jeff just turn on his screen, and if he would care just to do a very brief introduction and for our board to be able to get introduced to you in this first format. Jeff, are you able to join us?
Yeah.
Would you say your job title again, please? Dan was too quick.
Yeah, it's Deputy Director of our Trails and Facilities team. So the service area that has to do with our facility management, trails, trailheads, as well as capital projects. So yeah, thanks, Dan. And it's really an honor and privilege to join the team, to come alongside such a great team of dedicated and passionate staff, as you all likely know, as you've seen throughout the various projects and programs, and certainly have great shoes to fill with Jim Reeder and Steve Armstead and just some of the other staff that led that service area, as well as just coming alongside all the staff that are on that team, many of whom you heard about this evening with the fire response that have done just such a great job. So yeah, I'm honored and very excited to move into this role. In fact, I've been with the city for about 10 years, the city of Boulder. Previously, I was with our Parks and Recreation department. So I've actually worked closely with Dan and many of the staff in open space and mountain parks for many years now. So it's a nice, pretty seamless transition to come over to this team. And so with Parks and Rec, I manage our planning and ecological services team. So our urban forestry division, our natural lands team, a lot of our planning and design and construction of parks and recreation facilities and parkland, as well as our historic and cultural assets. So again, I bring some knowledge and experience within the city to this role, and look forward to working with open space and mountain parks in that realm as well. I've had about 20 years of experience just within the realm of public land management in a variety of capacities. So yeah, it's exciting to be here. And in fact, I look forward to perhaps getting to know and kind of build a relationship with each of you on the board as well. Perhaps once I get settled in a little bit more, we can find some time to meet each one of you and just kind of build that relationship as well. So, and Michelle, we worked together actually. I'm excited to work with Michelle. She was previously on our Parks and Rec advisory board during my time at Parks and Rec. So it's nice to see you again as well. So yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell. And like Dan said, I've been here about 3 days now, and it's exciting to finally be on board.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Jeff, I wanted to say welcome, and I'm also one of probably the few board members who've been able to meet you and work with you in real life.
Yeah.
And when I look at the screen, I'm like, I haven't met most of these people, so it's nice to have a familiar face and an established relationship. Welcome to the department, and we're so fortunate to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it is an interesting time to be starting new positions and new roles that you've experienced being on the board. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
And one of the So totally really excited to introduce Jeff, and then a big tear comes to my eye for what that also means. And that also means that this is the last board meeting for Mr. Steve Armstead, who probably, I don't know, Steve, how many of these meetings you've attended over your 30 years of service to the city of Boulder, but I'd imagine it's probably over 100. And so I just want to also recognize that with the coming of and the welcoming of Jeff, it's also a time to say goodbye and a thank you, a huge thank you to 3 decades of service that Steve Armstead provided the department and our community, from being a ranger for many years to working on planning projects, to working on project coordination, to serving in the deputy role, and then to also for the past 9 months providing great leadership to our trails and facilities service area. You know, it's just a testament to Steve to step into, if there's a role that's needed and I've got skills and talents that align with it, count me in, I'll do it. And he's the definition of a public servant. And I just want to recognize it is the last meeting for Steve that he'll be part of, and to wish him a fond farewell. A week from Friday would be his last official day with Open Space. And you know it, buddy, you're going to be really, really missed. And just want to thank you for everything that you've brought to me and brought to our community.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. I've seen a lot over those 30 years, and it actually extends even beyond that. When I first walked in as a ranger intern back in 1987. So over those decades, I've seen a lot grow, change, but no matter what, you know, I've got some imprint in the evolution of this system, way back from mountain parks to the open space and real estate, now to the Osmp. And I'm kind of super proud every moment I have to be able to connect with the system. And I've been super proud to serve this community, which the number of different board meetings I've attended also mean there's been a great contribution of a lot of great trustees that care deeply about this system. And I put you 5 amongst those, knowing that it takes a lot of time, dedication to really be the stewards of the system. But it's that collaboration between the community members, between those who are the ardent supporters of the open space system, and staff, a lot of great staff that keep this system kind of functioning and being such a model of what a natural system that is, you know, managed and cared for by a community can be, and how that serves the benefit of the community and all those natural creatures that are living in those environments. And so I know it's hard for me to leave because there's so much I've contributed and grown, but I also know it's in great hands, and look forward to be actually able to go out, probably like Dave. Now you know how it feels to go out and know that you've had your time and place, but now you can kind of also look at it from a whole new perspective, just as a visitor. So I look forward to being able to do that. So thank you all. And I really will miss kind of the legacy of what this whole program is about.
Thank you.
Love you, Steve.
Steve, 100 OSBT meetings ago, was your hairline more like Jeff's? Can we do a quick screenshot?
It was, Michelle, it was really embarrassing. We did have the typical show some photos, you know, over the years, and there was some photos of my early years. And yes, there was a nice curly black crop of hair up there, which is, it's amazing to think about how that's changed over the years.
It's the OSBT meetings, I know it.
Yeah, that contributed, I will have to guarantee.
And,
Well, I guess I know what my fate's gonna be.
Yeah.
And a butterfly net, which you haven't seen him with recently.
No, I do have plans. That net is actually over in the corner of my office here. So it will go out more often with me now. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks for everything, Steve.
Yeah, thank you all.
Great. All right. Well, we do have a super great program update for you. As you know, most meetings we try to provide update on a significant program area for the department. And this month we're bringing forward a vegetation stewardship program update. And for that, I'm going to invite Chris Warner, our Vegetation Stewardship Senior Manager, to lead us through this program update for you. Chris?
All right, thanks, Dan. So yeah, I get the opportunity to maybe deliver some good news tonight. So we'll talk about some positive stuff. And I'm going to try to share my screen and see if I can drive the show here. Let's see. Are you seeing a presentation?
Looks good.
All right. All right. So, yeah, so as Dan said, I am the Vegetation Stewardship Senior Manager. I get the opportunity to oversee a number of our programs, forestry and veg management and ecological restoration. So it's a broad range of stuff going on. You know, we really get to do a lot of the boots on the ground stuff. So I was going to take the opportunity tonight to kind of give you a background on who we are, who the group is, who makes up Veg Stewardship on Osmp. Give you kind of an idea of both kind of high level of what we do, and then drill down to talk about some 2021 highlights of our program. And then really kind of talk about what's on tap for 2022 going forward, and then make sure we leave time for questions at the end, and hopefully some conversation with all of you. So this, just to kick us off here, this is a picture of forestry work going on in the Shanahan Ridge area. This is an area that we spent a lot of time on in 2021. Lots of help from junior rangers and our forest crew on this one. So who we are, I want to start this slide off by saying that we've got probably 20 to 25 seasonal and temp positions that are not represented on this slide. Too many people to list, and just an incredible workforce of folks. But I wanted to really highlight the standard staff that run those crews. Starting with our Veg Management Program, Kelly Ewing is our newest addition. As many of you know, Lori Dieter was with the department until the middle of 2021, and she retired after 30 plus years with City Open Space and Mountain Parks. So an incredible amount of knowledge that left with her, but Kelly has really slotted in, and Kelly brings with her a ton of knowledge and ton of experience to slot into our Veg Management Program. And then Kelly works with Nick Bankston, John Giesentanner, and Steve Weber, who are our crew leads and Veg Program specialists. They're the ones out there getting the work done on pulling weeds, managing crews, coordinating volunteer efforts, all kinds of stuff that's going on out in the field that I'll talk a little bit more about. They get to oversee these folks in this picture, pulling myrtle spurge in the Anemone area. Seem to be having a pretty good time there pulling weeds, which, you know, if that's your office, it's a good setup. Our Forest Management Program, Mike Steinbeiss is our Forest Operations Supervisor. He is really overseeing a lot of the on-the-ground work in our forests, fire mitigation, forest health, forest restoration projects. Once again, these are the saws and the chippers out there making a lot of noise and getting a ton of work done. Mike works with Ben Cook and Chris Deeroff, who are our forest crew leads. They're really overseeing the operations out there and making sure everything is going smoothly and everybody's staying safe. And then last but not least is our Ecological Restoration Program. So the third leg in our stewardship program. Megan Bose is our senior restoration ecologist. Megan does a great job of kind of planning at the higher level, overseeing projects, working with contractors, making sure our restoration projects get done, and working closely with Kevin Shields, our restoration crew lead, who is once again managing crews, managing volunteers, getting the work done on the ground. So what is it we do? Like I said, I want to kind of start at the high level and drill down to some specific examples. But in general, our veg management program is really focused on managing our non-native and invasive plant species across the system. Like I said, they could be pulling myrtle spurge one day, driving cattle for tallow grass the next day, and waist deep in a pond doing northern leopard frog habitat the next. So really a diverse span of projects for the veg management program. Forest management, kind of what it sounds like, managing and restoring our forested ecosystems. About a quarter of the OSMP system, about 10,000 acres is forested. So a lot of work going on in our forests on a regular basis. This is another one I'll drill down and talk about what we got done in 2021, but tons of great work out there. And then finally, Ecological Restoration Program. This runs the spectrum of wetlands and riparian restoration projects, working with our grassland staff, working with our trail staff, any of those systems that have been impacted or damaged or degraded really falls in the purview of the Ecological Restoration Program. And they coordinate across a wide variety of programs within the department to get great work done. And then I also wanted to just kind of talk about some overarching themes, I guess, for each one of these programs. The monitoring and inventory data is key and essential to everything that these programs do. Making sure that we're on track, doing the things that we said we're going to do, meeting our goals. That's really about making sure that we're mapping and monitoring and measuring all the systems that are out there to really track the success of our ongoing management. And then, really meeting the goals of our overarching management plans. Obviously, FEMP is, that's us driving the implementation of our forest ecosystem management plan. The grassland management plan weighs into a lot of the priorities that ecological restoration and vegetation management are doing. And then obviously meeting a lot of the goals of the master plan, as well as other kind of, I guess, historic management plans that we've got across the department. So like I said, that's kind of high level. And I wanted to drill down to a couple of examples for each one of these programs, just to give you kind of a little taster of everything that's going on out there. So for a veg management program, like I said, this is our weeds and nasties out there. We had a crew of 10 seasonal and temporary staff in 2021, 8 crew members and 2 assistant crew leads. Really staffed for about 9 months out there cranking along. They had about $65,000 in grant funding in 2021 that came from a variety of sources, really focused on list A species management, as well as kind of a mix of other OSMP priority weed projects. They pulled over 55,000 individual list A plants. They actually counted 55,000. They've got little tickers as they go. And that's one of those monitoring pieces of keeping track of those fluctuations of plants that are on the ground. And that really equates to about 6,600 acres of treatments across the system. And like I said, that's everything from forests and grasslands to this picture shows them treating non-natives in a pond in the Lindsay area for northern leopard frog habitat. So all over OSMP is really the focus of veg management. And then collaborative efforts. Obviously the weeds don't stop at the fence. So working with our neighbors, Boulder County, Jefferson County, a lot of coordination with some of those force multipliers out there, WRV, Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, Ready to Work, other volunteer efforts, just working with neighborhood groups has been an opportunity to increase the number of hands out there and boots on the ground for vegetation management projects. So one specific highlight, I guess, for 2021 that I wanted to put out there was our tallow grass management. If you read any of my memos at the beginning of the year, you know the tallow grass project has been one that's sort of grown and evolved over the past couple of years. In 2021, we increased grazing and the infrastructure to support grazing in the Shanahan Ridge area. Grazing units increased from 170 acres to 500 acres in 2021. And we were able to get 50 cattle that rotated through these 4 grazing enclosures in the spring of 2021 with close coordination with our ag group, our ranger group, education outreach, kind of across the board to make that happen, as well as really coordinating with neighbors and volunteers to make sure we eliminated a lot of the surprises and the issues, I guess, that came up along with having cattle in an area that they hadn't previously been in. The photos on the right are part of an ongoing photo monitoring project in this area. The photo on the top is a tallow grass enclosure. This one's in the Cragmore area there, kind of the second from the top area. So the top photo is 2020 and the bottom photo is 2021. So shows a definite decrease in tallow grass overall, but really you can start to see, you know, the natives expressing themselves, the decrease in duff and, you know, all the kind of additional goals that we were going for in our grazing operations there. So forest management, once again, lots of stuff going on in our forests. In 2021, we had a crew of 7 temporary staff for roughly 9 months. That's in addition to the 2 crew leads, Ben and Chris, that were just phenomenal resource in our forests and really well-trained folks. This is, you know, as you can imagine, working with chainsaws and chippers and tractors and heavy equipment. This is one where you want folks that know what they're doing and are paying attention. So the forest crew spent over 11,000 total crew hours in 2021 on forest management tasks. They thinned a total of 141 acres and 2 priority projects. I'm going to talk about the Shanahan Ridge area, but we also spent time in the Sunshine area. Those of you that were on the Anemone Trail field trip got an opportunity to see what was going on in the Sunshine area. In 2021, we were supported by $80,000 in grant funding. This was a federal fire mitigation grant that we got in 2019 to do the work in Shanahan. So, you know, those grant opportunities have been really incredible for expanding our efforts. We sampled a total of 109 overstory inventory plots. So this is really the information that feeds into those prescriptions on the ground. How many trees are out there? What do they look like? What's the structure? So these overstory inventory plots are really essential in knowing what we're doing and if we're meeting those goals of the forest ecosystem management plan. We had over 1,000 hours worked with junior rangers in 2021 and volunteers and ready to work groups. Once again, that force multiplier aspect of having lots of boots on the ground is essential when you're drag and slash or running stuff through the chipper. Lots of smiles from junior rangers. You know, that's the crew's least exciting days is when they're running the chipper, and you know the junior rangers can't get enough of it. So that's something that'll continue as long as we can support that. and then worked 9 separate fire assignments in 4 different states. So one of the cool things that our forest management crew has been a part of is a broader countywide type 2 fire response module. So they've been able to go out on national fires. They get the opportunity to see fire, see different ecosystems, just kind of get experience in a wide variety of fire management goals. And then they have the opportunity to bring that back to open space as, you know, kind of translating it into our ability to fight wildfire events and work once again with resources across the county. So the project, like I said, I was going to highlight for our forest management was in the Shanahan Ridge area. Within about 120 acres in Shanahan Ridge this year. We tend to focus a lot of these projects in areas where the topography and the fuels and the wind might line up and address the fire risk in adjacent neighborhoods, you know, in this case, South Boulder, but also get a lot of bang for our buck from an ecological standpoint and restore these areas where fire has been removed and we have more fuel than we would have historically. The visualizations on the right are just that they're sort of snapshots of the data. So when you collect those overstory inventory points, we're able to translate that into these kind of virtual representations of what's on the ground. And this is a pre and post measurement of what was out there. So you see, you know, the big thing is decreasing the density of trees, but then also opening up meadows, looking for spacing in the trees, just reducing the fuels in a lot of these areas, just kind of across the board. So this was a pretty great project. And if you haven't walked the North Fork of the Shanahan, I would suggest walking it and seeing if you can pick out impacts from our thinning, which, you know, should be fairly minimal. We're pretty light on the land, and just kind of look at the overall structure of the forest out there and how it looks post treatment. And then finally, our Ecological Restoration group. They had a total of 7 temporary and seasonal crew members in 2021. This was kind of a mix. They had 4 longer term temps, and then, or I'm sorry, 3 longer term temps that span that April through November. And then they also did 4 more kind of traditional seasonal positions, I guess, in 2021. So we had those folks basically work the 4 high months in the summer when we could get a whole lot of work done with those additional hands. I'll talk about a little bit about this more on the next slide, but we leveraged over $200,000 from Mile High Flood Control in 2021. They were doing some work, obviously to address flood control, but they just happened to be in project areas where we were also working along Boulder Creek and in the McClintock drainage. So we were able to work in our project areas as well as expand work that they were doing in these different areas with them kicking money in. And then a kind of unique aspect of our ecological restoration program is our native seed collection and native plant kind of grow out process. So these are projects where we work with volunteers and staff to collect seed. In 2021, we collected 11 different species of grasses and forbs. And we spent over 400 hours of staff time and volunteer time in 2021 on these collection processes. So they go out and they collect seed. As you can imagine, you can get a decent amount of a hand collected seed, but then we can also send this out and increase it using growers across the country. So one example, this year we increased Western wheatgrass. We sent it out and we got 1,400 pounds back of native seed with kind of a local genotype, which is great for projects across the system. We provided locally sourced seed to 24 projects across Osmp, and this runs the gamut of our own restoration projects, trailhead construction, new trail construction, anything that needs seed, we can provide that, and know that it's seed that came locally. And then over 100 or 1,000 hours spent working with Ready to Work on crew restoration projects, which is incredible. Once again, that force multiplier to get additional hands out there. This photo shows one of our volunteers planting one of 500 shrubs that we put in the South Boulder Creek drainage at South Mesa Trailhead this year. So again, kind of working in collaborative efforts with Ready to Work volunteers, lots of other opportunities there. So the project for our ecological restoration program I was going to focus on is kind of a mix of multiple projects along the Boulder Creek corridor. The map might be a little bit hard to see, but that's Pearl Parkway along the north and Arapahoe on the south, 55th to the east, and Foothills Parkway to the west. So this is a couple of project areas, like I said, from the hospital area, the kind of the bottom left of that map, that first circle. This is an area where we've been working on addressing non-native trees, non-native vegetation. We've done a number of volunteer projects and over the past couple of years, and this is an opportunity where we had a couple of volunteers sort of adopt this area. We've had 3 volunteers that came to a project a couple of years ago and haven't left, which is pretty great. They show up on their own time. They spent over 200 hours of volunteer time just pulling weeds in this area and meeting a lot of our goals as far as the restoration in here goes. They pulled 80 bags of non-native species out of here just in 2021 alone. And then if you move down Boulder Creek a little bit to the Cottonwood Grove area there, that middle circle, these photos on the left represent what's going on in that area. This is an area where we're really addressing the non-native tree cover. So the green ash and the non-natives, and really opening it up. Like I said, those pictures on the left are a representation of kind of the before conditions and then the after. So this is an area where we worked with Mile High Flood Control, and they put in about $120,000 to do some tree management. We had CIP dollars that we hired a contractor to do. So this is kind of one of those projects that we just keep chipping away at and really addressing the overall function of the riparian and wetland areas in here. And then finally, moving to the east there, that's Cottonwood Pond, the Goose Creek area. This is a former gravel mine that we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers in the past to restore more of a wetland. You know, it was a deep pond that didn't meet a whole lot of ecological goals. It was restored a couple of years ago with a lot of effort from the Army Corps of Engineers and staff. And then we had some neighborhood beavers move in this year and dammed it up, and it converted back to a pond. So this is an example of kind of ongoing management that you know, we worked with wildlife to relocate the beavers. We broke up the dam. We addressed acres of cattails in there to really open it up. We did seeding to get the native wetland species going again. So just kind of a mix of examples of what's going on in here, the Boulder Creek corridor, but this is kind of an example of a lot of the riparian restoration to meet some of our grassland management plan goals across the system. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, the budget stuff, but I did want to just kind of give you an idea of the budget breakdown for these three programs, and I guess how we're funding a lot of this work on the ground. So the standard staff expenses, you see that's probably the largest portion of all of these. This covers both kind of our year-round standard crew leads, as well as the subject matter experts and the ecologists and the folks running the programs. And then those non-standard expenses, that's probably the second biggest chunk for everybody. Those are, that's funding those 20 to 25 seasonals and temps that we hire every year. Operating budget, that's really all about the equipment, contracted services, really the stuff, to make the magic happen. The chains and chainsaws and all that kind of stuff is coming out of that operating budget. Some of us rely more than others on the CIP budget. Ecological Restoration has a relatively big need because they're doing a lot of contracted work. Those big tree projects are stuff that we can't do in-house. So a lot of that funding comes from CIP for Veg Management. CIP's funding a lot of the tallow grass infrastructure and grazing. And then finally, grants have been a big piece for both Veg Management and Forest Management. Ongoing additional money that can help expand our crews, add to overtime, extend these seasons, just a variety of things. So in 2022, lots more work planned. Even though we pulled 55,000 list A species, there's still more out there, and they keep growing. So that continues to be a focus. Spring tallow grass grazing, that isn't going to end anytime soon. We're continuing to do that. We're looking at other opportunities to expand that program to other areas of the system. We are continuing to do a lot of rapid assessment mapping for veg management. So looking at where the weeds are and taking it as an opportunity to track effectiveness on the system, as well as set priorities for specific areas. And then, those collaborative efforts will continue, working with NCAR on tallow grass, Ready to Work, WRV, Department of Ag, and neighboring landowners to really continue a lot of that great work that we've built on over time. In the forest, again, kind of more of those thinning projects adjacent to communities, low elevation ponderosa pine forests. In Mesa, we've got $80,000 in grant funds to do some work in that area. Chautauqua, we're going to be working with the Chautauqua Association on thinning on the open space side of the property, as well as we got grant funds for them to do fire mitigation within the neighborhood, I guess, to do defensible space and some projects like that within the Chautauqua Association. So that's been a pretty unique opportunity. West Anemone, we're working with the 4 Mile Fire Protection District to do some work. We've got another $70,000 in grants to do that, and really addressing some of those areas in Boulder Canyon, Sunshine Canyon, kind of the western edge, as well as some of the neighborhoods up there as well. And then that understory, overstory monitoring, that'll continue so we can track our success going forward. And then, an important piece of our planning has been the kind of the landscape scale coordination. As we've seen, fire knows no boundaries. So working with the Boulder County Fire Shed, the CU Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities, Boulder Forest Collaborative, and then just working with our neighboring fire protection districts to look for opportunities to look bigger scale and landscape scale at some of these projects. And then finally, our ecological restoration program. A lot of continued work in Boulder Creek and South Boulder Creek corridors. A lot of that non-native removal, both kind of at the lower forbs and weedy kind of species, as well as some of the larger non-native trees that can shade out some of our native vegetation. Integrating our ecological restoration efforts into ongoing site plans. So anywhere we've got projects going on, we look for opportunities to expand our ecological restoration projects. So Gebhardt, South Mesa Trailhead, Gun Barrel, some of those projects where we've got other work going on and we can kind of tag team into CIP dollars or ongoing management dollars. Providing staffing and prescriptions for undesignated trails will continue to be something that we work on. This is something that we work really closely with our trails group on, identifying priorities, where they're going to do work. Can we do work to address undesignated trails and address some of those situations where we may have kind of unintended impacts from undesignated trails and use where folks maybe don't understand or know where they should be going or stand on trail. And then continued collaboration here as well. Ready to Work, volunteers, Southern Rockies Seed Network has been a great resource in looking for other opportunities to expand our seed programs. And then Mile High Flood Control, continuing to work with those folks on funding going forward. So that was a very quick snapshot of what we do and where we do it. You know, it's tough to cover it all, but hopefully that gives you an idea of the diversity of our work and what's going on out there. And yeah, I'll leave it at that and see if we have any questions or conversation.
Great, thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Questions or comments? Dave?
Chris, thanks for that. The question I have is, given the recent interest this year, actually, and then more focused this past couple of weeks here on wildfire, can you take a few minutes and talk to us about the prescribed burn program and the challenges that program faces as we look at trying to manage ecologically forest environments? And particularly, we know that with thinning, if you come in, shortly thereafter and do a prescribed burn, that in certain situations, that works really well as far as reducing the risk of wildland fire. And so anyway, if you would talk for a few minutes about the challenges that prescribed fire presents as far as a management tool in urban areas.
Sure. I'll try to narrow it down and not spend too much time on it. But yeah, the challenges are, well, I guess to step back, the benefits are definitely well understood. And I think we continue to try to use that tool in our toolbox as much as possible. The challenges do, kind of pile up. This is an interesting year and a good example of some of those challenges. We had a really wet spring. We went from snow on the ground to standing water to green conditions in the spring. So we really didn't have a spring burning window. And then in the fall, we had, we're still dealing with it. We're exceptionally dry conditions. And, we didn't have a burn window in the fall either. So that seems to be how things are trending, unfortunately, is we just, the window of opportunity for prescribed burns seems to get smaller and smaller and smaller as time goes on. So, being able to burn and meet our objectives in a safe way has always been a challenge and will continue to be a challenge, I think. You know, the other considerations are just our landscape context of, you know, we are directly adjacent to homes, and, you know, there's no change in that. And it makes our smoke conditions and considerations a whole lot more complex. It makes our burning considerations a whole lot more complex. We just, you know, it's a challenge to drop a match when you're within, you know, half a mile of dozens of homes. So those are, I guess, some of the very broad challenges. There's, you know, kind of more detail we could go into, but hopefully that gets to your question at least a little bit.
Yeah, thanks.
Others?
Chris, I just wanted you to know that your comment about not going too far into the weeds was not missed.
No pun intended.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think it's very impressive for me to see the 3 different program areas that you supervise, and yet the threads that follow through each of them, from the monitoring and the diverse array of people involved, from full-time professionals to part-timers to volunteers, junior rangers, ready to work people, older folks from the community, and also the grant funding that you've acquired to really expand what's being done. And it's clear every time I go out on the system how important the control of invasives is, and what a huge unending job, almost unending job that is, as well as Dave mentioned, the fire mitigation work, and the ecological restoration, just because we use these lands and in some cases overuse them. So thank you for putting together such robust programs that really draw on diverse resources to do the most possible with the resources that the department has.
Yeah, thanks.
Appreciate it, Chris. Great job. Really informative. And thanks, Karen, for the nice words.
Thank you, Chris.
Dan, I'm just wondering before we go on what the appetite for a short break is.
I'll let you know on my end that I've just got maybe 2 minutes of verbal updates, and under the matters from the board item, we were unable to meet as a subcommittee today. So we have just a very brief update on item A. So I don't know what you all have for other items on the board, but from a staff perspective, we maybe have 5 to 10 minutes of material.
Okay. Can we all hang in there for a while longer? All right, let's keep going. Thanks.
All right, great. So just in the theme of program updates, just want to alert you to upcoming program updates in February. You'll get an update on our science program, and sort of complementing one of the written items in today's packet regarding a very specific element of our agricultural program, the agricultural leasing update. Andy and Amy Wilhite and their team will be coming forward in March to provide you with a much more comprehensive update on our agricultural and water program. So that right now is slated for March. And then in April, we will have Janelle come forward with volunteer services updates. So that's what's forthcoming from a staff perspective to further all of our collective education and to get further informed about what's happening on the ground with open space. Any questions about that? All right, second reminder is, and this is something that we daylighted at the community open house meeting on December 10th, as well as last month's board meeting, but just a reminder that the draft plague management plan is out for public comment until the 24th of January. Val Matheson from the planning department is heading that up, and she is the one who's accepting any public comment. So if anybody does care to provide any comments to Val on that draft plan, that deadline would be the 24th of January. And finally, I've got just a good announcement. You may be recall that our project to upgrade and restore the Cottontail Trail was put on hold due to some issues that we had with the former contractor. We're proud to, not proud, but excited to announce that a new contractor has been selected and is ready to begin to restart that project. And what that means is that with favorable weather, they could start mobilizing their equipment and begin work as early as next week. And the hope is to have the work completed within the next 3 months. So we'll be, Phil Yates will be helping us put out some press releases and announcements on Nextdoor in terms of the updates and getting out that will go out to adjacent neighborhoods and putting up some signs, because we will have to sort of officially emphasize the trail closure that is in place once the contractors get out on the site. So those are your verbal updates for the evening. And with that, Karen, I think we're ready to turn it back over to you for matters from the board.
Okay. Do you want to come back in just briefly, Dan, and say just a little bit more about the next steps on finalizing the disposal request procedures?
Yeah, so, and Hal, I'll have you chime in too. But just a reminder that Bethany Collins and I are working with Hal and Caroline on looking at revising the current process and procedures for how staff and board would consider requests that come forward. It's been a project that's about a year and a half so far that we've been working on it, with a little bit of a pause last year. Was kind of a significant pause. We've asked the board in late Q4 of 2021 to, if you have any comments you would like to where the draft is at this point, to please bring those forward to the subcommittee so they can be considered. Of course, we have Hal and Caroline on the committee themselves, so they've been able to provide their input along the way. And we have heard suggestions and comments from Karen and Dave. So just a reminder that because the subcommittee didn't meet, that if you do have any final comments you would like the subcommittee to consider, that I guess there's still time. And Hal, this is a sort of a message to you that we'll be rescheduling that subcommittee date for a time that works for the four of us. The goal is, and Hal, this is where you could chime in, is that the subcommittee can still get its work done on producing what we would consider a final subcommittee draft for the full board's consideration at the February meeting. And so our hope is that we could daylight the final draft in February, get a lot of sort of question and answers back and forth, and set us up really well for the March meeting, in which we're hoping to get acceptance of a final document. So Hal, with that, I think I'll just invite you to see if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that was a great overview, Dan. I think one point I'll make about it is that the document essentially defines the application, or someone who would be seeking a disposal would present a certain packet of information which the staff has determined it feels is appropriate to begin a conversation. It does not preclude the board from asking for more or additional information in the future. And I think the one way this project could get off track is people thinking that we need to predict every single thing a future board might want to see, which we really do not. It's simply what we believe the consistent and usual packet should contain that staff should receive from an applicant at that initial time of application. So as long as we're all clear on sort of the overarching goal, I think, in my opinion, this is already a 93% solid A- getting towards A document. So I hope we can make ready progress.
Yeah, and the subcommittee's been very judicious about making sure there's language to that effect of, and any additional information that the department would request to sort of cover those nuanced situations that, you know, will inevitably come up, that we may want information that isn't exactly spelled out in the document, but we're providing ourselves the leeway in the language to be able to request additional information.
Okay, so we will be getting that new draft in the next packet, is that right?
Yes, so our goal, me starting tomorrow, is to see if the four of us, if the subcommittee can get a date on their calendar, we'll consider the comments that have come in over the past month or so, and feedback that we've gotten from trustees. Build that into a new document to be part of the final packet, or the board packet in February, yes.
Great, thank you. Caroline?
Yeah, I wanted to add something, but I'm kind of lost on where we are. Are we on matters from the board now?
Yes, A, matters from the board, A.
Okay. So in regards to this, I just wanted to put the proposal out, and if it doesn't work for people, that's fine. If it does, great. I feel like we have a lot of license and disposal requests coming up this year. I guess I'll stop there and say, Dan, do you feel like that is an accurate statement for what 2022 is going to bring to us? Do we have
there's no way of predicting it, but we have gone back and looked historically, and we do average, and there could be a year where we have 0, but we do average 2 to 4 requests a year that come our way, somewhere in that range. Some years are going to be lower than that, and other years, based on circumstances, may be higher. The other thing is that we have a very nuanced program here, so sometimes a conservation easement amendment request has a disposal element to it. So there's a lot of disposals that come forward that the members of the public or even staff and trustees have a hard time figuring out why it's treated as a disposal. So, but Caroline, it's not unusual for us to have 2 to 4 a year.
So kind of going off of that, what I'm proposing is to ask the other board members if there is a study session that they would like to have in January prior to the February meeting, so that all of us have the opportunity to speak with each other specifically about this matter, what the document will look like moving forward, how we feel about current, past, historical. It's kind of just a way for us to have a moment for all of us to be on the same level. I know we've all been able to turn in our own edits and what have you, but if that is something that the board feels like would be valuable or beneficial to them, I just wanted to put that out there because I wanted all of us to feel heard. So with that being said, I guess I'll see if anyone has a comment, and then after that I'll ask if that is something anyone thinks that they do or don't want to move forward with. So I guess what I'll suggest is keeping with the Wednesday, keeping with the evening. Does anyone feel like they would like to do, maybe a 1 or 2 hour study session regarding all things license and disposal before our next meeting, and we bring you something a little more concrete? So I guess I'll just ask each person. If no one's going to say yes or no. Karen, I'll start with you just because you're kind of heading the meeting.
Dave has a comment already, so.
You know, I think that would be helpful. I guess, Dan, the concern I have is I don't know. I think this document is pretty important, especially kind of given what the board will encounter in the future. And so I'm just worried that by, February, that we get a document that's going to be rather lengthy and, substantive, that deserves some adequate time to, review and think about. So I would certainly support, having a study session of an hour or so or two, to make sure that the board knows kind of what it's going to be getting, at the February meeting, and then presumably make some kind of decision in March.
Dan, before you jump in, I'd just like to offer the alternative viewpoint, which is that if we have a study session, I fear that what this board will be looking at and trying to do is to design a document which is prepared to handle all eventualities, which is an impossibility. And the document should aim to provide an ample and thorough application for all applicants for the average complexity of a request, not the most complex, not the least complex. And it's very important that the document doesn't doesn't become a longer, more complex document that aims at the most complex disposal situations, because that will make life needlessly difficult and complex for the average applicant and all those that have less than average complexity. Given that the document does not have the legal authority or the position in the Home Rule Cities law to alter, in any case, this board's ability to judge the disposal process, I fail to see why we are concerned that we are predicting with perfect confidence everything we might like. To my point of view, just like as unfolded in the CU South process, any disposal of great complexity, I expect will go through a long deliberative process where the specific things related to that unique request are requested by OSBT. And to spend too much time trying to predict what these unique situations will do is essentially ill-spent effort. So that's the alternative viewpoint.
I definitely hear you with that. And I don't think it certainly isn't my intention. And I guess I shouldn't speak for others, but that the point is to have this meeting to make things more complicated. I agree with you on the simplicity of the document. To a certain extent, I don't want that to get construed wrong because of the word simplicity. But I think it was more of any brain building or any ideas that we want to share, or what the five of us could come up with, having the allotted time to be able to speak to each other. But again, I'm happy to do it and I'm happy to not. So I just wanted to see what everyone else kind of felt about it.
Yeah, Hal, I'm a little perplexed at your speculation of complexity. For me, my interest is making sure that when we get a document in February, that we, have a relatively sure effort in order to get it in a final form for a decision in March. And so for me, if we have this preliminary discussion, we can certainly make sure that there aren't any potholes that we're going to go into in February, which I think would be unfortunate in moving this thing along.
So is anybody perceiving potholes that they have not yet informed this committee about?
Let me just make a comment, because I haven't thought about this possibility of study session first, but my perception of what could, and in my opinion, should be discussed by the board are the primary elements or components that need to be included in the draft. And when I reviewed the draft, that's the lens through which I critiqued it. And I found some elements that I thought would really be important to submit as part of a request for disposal or license that were missing. And so if there were to be a discussion prior to the committees producing the final draft, I would see the discussion being focused on what are the primary elements or components that this document should set forth. And are there some that are missing that need to be added rather than being a wordsmithing exercise? Because in my mind, any kind of revisions of wording would need to come after the final draft is in the packet for February.
So which brings me back to my initial point, Karen, which is that if people think things need to be added, the trustees need to understand that's an alternative view to where the staff has come in their judgment about where the right place to set the requirements for the initial application are without precluding further requests by the board. And the idea that we're going to put everything you might want to see on any disposal that we have seen on this list does an injustice to the core purpose of the document, which is to simply create a consistent application process for each applicant that is aimed at the average applicant, not the most complex applicant.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you saying that, and I think that hearing you say that makes me feel even more that, you know, if other board members want to, that having the study session might be a good idea, because it feels like there is a disconnect, because I hear you loud and clear, and I agree with you.
Yep. I agree. Let's do that then. And I just want to be clear from my side as a committee member, I will not be supporting an attempt to pre-adjudicate disposals with this document, which is meant to be a favor to staff about how they would like the application to look. So if it's going to take going into a study session to show that there's a divided board on this, then you're probably right, it is important. I really do not exactly see the thrust or the level of interest in really altering what the staff asked us to do for them, but I will be delighted to hear about what people are seeing.
So I guess with that,
Can I chime in just a second? I found how your explanation quite compelling. And so, I mean, I am in the camp of not needing a study session.
Caroline, if I could mind just, and I'm not even going to talk about this particular subject matter, but more of the process. And that is in certain situations on certain projects that are definitely going to be related a lot to what board and staff have to work on together. There's on occasion we decide to form a subcommittee. And I think what I do think we need to sort of think about what the process should be for a subcommittee. And to me, it seems like the trustees have appointed 2 people to bring forth and to work collaboratively, seek feedback, work collaboratively, and then bring something forward to the board. And to me, I think we're like one step away from the subcommittee to sort of saying we've done our job. Now, after the subcommittee does its job, if the trustees feel like they need an additional meeting to work things through, whether it's a special meeting or a study session, you know, I think that's a great question. But I think in this case, the subcommittee hasn't met. We asked for feedback. And I would just say we should let the process of the subcommittee play itself out and then see where we land. And if the trustees feel like there's more work to be done than the subcommittee brought forward, then hey, in late February, let's put a study session on and kind of get to work again. That's
And
just sort of my perspective.
yeah, no, and I think that that's a good point. And I think for many things, like when you have the subcommittee, let the subcommittee deal with it, bring it back to the board and move forward. The reason for the suggestion is just because of the interest of disposal. I just want to make sure everyone feels heard. And the idea of doing it in January was to keep on point for the schedule laid out for completion in March. So I do agree with you, Dan, and what you said, but it was try to keep us on track. If anyone has anything that they would like to, share about this process, and the other portion of it is also what we had talked about in our retreat and kind of the overarching big picture and long-term management of, all things open space. And in doing so, it felt like this was a really good topic for everyone to be able to have that time to share their ideas, because as the years pass and this moves forward, as you said, there are several each year to be expected. It kind of puts this group all on the same page a little better than if we're submitting via email. So it was kind of twofold in trying to keep on the timeframe of completion while also honoring kind of the idea that we had at the retreat.
I thank you, Caroline. I appreciate that. I'll be the first to say I now believe that I misjudged. A couple meetings ago, I heard some frustration from co-board members about not receiving what felt like a clear and consistent packet of application. And I thought at that moment that it had all of a sudden the purpose of this document had really clearly occurred to trustees about why staff had originally made the request and particularly why they'd structured it the way that they did. And I may have misanalyzed that. I do think you're right. There's a lot to talk about on the subject of disposal. I just don't think the definition of what the application for it looks like is necessarily the best and appropriate venue. I fully expect, just as it has been for this board, that each and every disposal will get a very thorough consideration by whatever board is sitting at that time. And so I don't worry about that. It was a hope of mine to try and deliver this during my time here. But I can see if we're going to try and add study sessions in light of the fire that's going on, all these other pivots, that I will maybe then just, if that's the preference of the board, I'll relax my desire to bring it over the finish line and I'll let future trustees figure that out.
I'd like to make a suggestion based on what I think I've heard. I think we were asked to submit our suggestions because the subcommittee wanted to hear those. And what I would ask is if our suggestions are not going to be incorporated, if there could be some kind of a sidebar that said, X was suggested, but discarded because blah, blah, blah. So that when it comes back to us and we don't see our ideas included, when we're reading the packet, we have some idea as to why those things are not included.
That seems fair.
And
yeah, I think that is fair. And I also don't have a problem with having a potential study session after the February meeting, if that's desirable or necessary.
That's the other thing I was going to say. I like the sequence that Dan laid out of having the subcommittee meet, producing a final draft that then comes to us in the February packet. We deliberate about that. And if there are some things to be ironed out, we have a study session before the March meeting.
Yeah.
That seems like a good compromise to me, Karen.
Okay, anything else about the disposal and license request procedures? I have some questions and concerns about one of the written information items that was attached to the agenda. And because the item B, the Jefferson County, Colorado Front Range Trail Feasibility Study, is expected to come back to us this year. And to me, that says it's going on a pretty speedy timeline. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose. And I'd leave it up to Dan about whether they need to be addressed now or just put on the table. But when I read that memo, I have a real question about what a feasibility study is designed to include. And when I read the memo, it seemed to me it meant feasibility for a location, a preferred trail alignment. And yet I see, as a trustee, I see several other things looming large as to question whether this is feasible. And among those are ecological and economic budgetary kinds of considerations. It sounds to me like the state is willing to put money into the building of the trail, and then it's not clear to me who takes on the responsibility of maintaining that trail. And as we know, over and over again through the years, the question of costs and payment for the maintenance of things can loom large. And I have a question about whether whether our budget can be stretched far enough to add maintenance for a large new trail system on top of dealing with the unexpected emergencies like the Marshall Fire and other disasters, you know, and where we're going into the future in terms of budget.
That's a very detailed question about what happens after the feasibility study. Was there a question about the feasibility study itself, or was it mainly will the feasibility study address those future considerations of maintenance, who does what, who's funding what?
Yeah, will the feasibility address whether it's even economically feasible? Not just whether there's a line on the map that makes sense to have the trail.
Right. I personally do not know that answer, but if there's one of our planning staff or Mark that's on the line that maybe has some information on that, or it could be something that we'll just have to get back to you on, Karen.
Okay, it looks like Casey might be ready to pounce.
Hi, Karen. Yes, it's my understanding that feasibility, Jeffco will be looking at the cost associated. Now, they're just looking at it on their lands, right? So they're assessing the feasibility of a segment from North Table Mountain to the North County line. But as part of that feasibility is cost, is my understanding.
Okay, and my reaction is, and if you build it up to our border, and then we just build a gate there, or, you know, it's the implications that it has for the next step in the trail that I'm concerned about.
I get that. I think what we attempted to do was in sharing, you know, our information to Jeffco. I think in the memo we put in a couple of alternatives. The first two bullets there were to take a look at where Rocky Mountain Greenway was being located. The screening criteria should include the level of service, our existing planned trail system, and then also a reference that, you know, future planning and discussions may need to occur as a result of this feasibility study as well. So I think we were trying to address that concern of additional capacity, co-locating, making sure that it gets put into place, and also saying, and if it's not, we're going to have some further discussions. I think we said that, you know, it would have further engagement, you know, needed. While there's not an opportunity for us to comment until the feasibility study is complete, you know, we'll definitely be working at the staff level. And then, you know, there's always a time for a comment or resolution, you know, that the board can make, you know, after the feasibility study is complete, you know, as well. So I want to, you know,
Is it possible that the screening criteria could include costs and funding sources?
Yeah, we can bring that forward at the staff discussions.
For both construction and maintenance. That'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Karen, in case you just add to it, Karen, typically like as the alternatives are weighed up, there's like a analysis of cost, like some kind of people say, oh, that's the best one, but turns out that's the 100 million compared to the 10 million one. So that is typically built into the process. So it's
and in my experience, it's generally the construction and not the maintenance, not the whole life cycle cost.
Good point. No, you're right, Karen. The life cycle is often missed. It's a really good point you're raising.
And God knows we have a lot of costs coming right up here. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions about the written information items or anything else before we end? Dave?
Yeah, Dan, I just want to follow up real quickly on the email I sent this afternoon on the council retreat. And you could, when you know kind of what the agenda is and what, you know, kind of some of the discussion topics will be, if you could just let the board know so that we're kind of on notice if we're interested in, you know, following what the council is talking about at the retreat. That would be helpful.
I put that request in as soon as the final agenda is produced to get it in my hands, and I'll get it out to you. I do know that the council made a decision that it will be virtual. They made that decision on Tuesday night at the study session. We do know it's from 4 to 8 on Friday, a week from Friday. So that would be the 21st, as well as the morning, Saturday morning, 8 to noon on the 22nd. It will be virtual. So a couple of things is just make sure you guys have the meeting link, which the public will have access to as well. And as soon as I get an agenda, I'll throw it your way.
Great, thanks.
Thanks. And you said 4 to 8 on Friday?
Yes.
Thank you. The other thing that I mentioned just briefly before this meeting started that I want to say again to make sure that everybody heard it is that in the hotline, staff's hotline post, which was a summary of all the board's input to council, EAB's priority had to do with something that was very similar to the item in our letter about doing some tracking of the costs and benefits of greenhouse gas reductions. Their item obviously had to do with the parks and the urban canopy, and ours obviously had to do with the open space lands. But I think there may be some opportunity for collaboration with EAB there this year. Okay, anything else from anybody? Thank you all. And with that, we will adjourn the meeting.
Thanks. Good luck getting home, Hal.
Yeah, good luck, Hal.
Yeah.